show, there is good news and bad news in a brand new Gallup poll about the political orientation of the American electorate. This is just released today. It shows that the number of people, the percentage of people who describe themselves as conservative, is up sharply since November, since the election of 2008, which is kind of surprising. It's the kind of thing you don't hear about in the press that much. The number of people who describe themselves liberal has remained constant, conservatism up. But that's the good news. The bad news for conservatives, whereas middle-aged and older Americans lean conservative versus liberal by 2 to 1, adults aged 18 to 29 are just as likely to say their political views are liberal, 31% as conservative, 30%. That's why it's so important to hear from a younger conservative thinker and activist like Reihan Salam, the co-author of the best-selling book, Grand New Party, How Republicans Can Win the Working Class and Save the American Dream. It is now available in paperback. Ryan, first of all, what do you make of the fact that conservatism, at least as a ideology that people claim, seems to have made a little bit of a comeback since the election?
I think it makes a lot of sense because when people look at some of the dramatic spending initiatives that have happened in the first few months of the Obama presidency and also late in the Bush presidency, there is this real belief, what's going on here? Shouldn't we be tightening our belts, or shouldn't we be trying to craft sustainable policies, not lurching back and forth in dramatic ways that might leave us in a real serious bind or leave our children with unsustainable debt? So I think that, there is a gut reaction on the part of a lot of people.
And that would also explain why it would have less impact for younger people, because younger people, consistently in poll after poll, are less worried about issues like spending and taxes.
Absolutely, even though they're going to be the ones left holding the bag. I mean, I think that's the irony of it to some degree. But I think that when you're thinking about younger voters, I mean, there's the thought that, they just aren't thinking about the same set of issues. But I also think that a lot of it has to do with the tone of a lot of today's conservatives, something that you've talked a lot about. So I think that, and also another important thing to note is that Barack Obama is far more popular than any of his policies. And so it becomes very difficult for the Republican Party because, on one level you want to take on the president, you want to challenge him aggressively. But when you do that, you end up actually alienating people because, again, he comes across as a moderate, pragmatic guy who's just doing his best for the country. And so, to some extent, that's something that Republicans have to navigate. Democrats had to navigate this during the Reagan era, and they mostly failed because, Reagan was very personally popular, but to some extent his policies were, the public liked some of them, didn't like others. But Democrats, were driven so crazy by Reagan that they ended up marginalizing themselves and looking like, like they just didn't get it to some degree.
Yeah, and by the way, we have a great big advantage over Democrats against President Reagan, and the advantage is named Nancy Pelosi. When President Reagan was president, you were too young to remember, but when President Reagan was president, there was no other Republican leader who could deflect fire. I mean, you had Howard Baker and Bob Dole, but they weren't. Nancy Pelosi, I mean, one of the greatest lines of attack I think we can have is that Barack Obama has consistently outsourced the drafting of legislation to Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid, and that's why it's become so ultra-liberal that he's a nice guy who has been, to a very great extent, I think this has the advantage of being true, who has been hijacked by radicals in his own congressional caucus. Let's go to Scott in Garden Grove, California. You're on the Michael Medved Show with Reihan Salam.
Oh, hi. I consider myself a Reagan Democrat from the 80s, and you're talking about wage stagnation, and unless you address illegal immigration and the benefits of free trade, which I don't see, I don't think you're addressing the issue. You're tiptoeing around it.
Ryan?
That's a good point. I mean, I think that in the book we do talk about immigration to some degree. We advocate a kind of saner immigration policy that will really crack down hard on, undocumented immigration into the country, which is really more about lawlessness than about anything else, I think. But I think that with regard to free trade, I think the issue is, do you think that American workers are the best and most productive workers in the world and can indeed win in an open, free, and fair competition? And I tend to think the answer to that is yes. But I know that there's a lot of anxiety about this, and one thing that I find interesting is that support for free trade has really reduced over the last decade or so when you started seeing not just manufacturing workers subject to foreign competition, but also professionals like lawyers and doctors starting to feel the heat from so-called offshoring. So I think that it reveals that to some extent the consensus that we've had was built on the fact that some people didn't really feel like their jobs were at stake.
Yeah, so what do you recommend in terms of a future Republican policy on the issue of free trade? Of course, President Reagan and all Republican leaders, certainly since President Reagan, have been strongly committed to free trade.
Well, my own view is that, I'm strongly supportive of free trade, but I also think that one problem with the way we approach the world right now is that we pit the middle class of one country against the middle class of another. I tend to think that the Chinese middle class are getting an extremely raw deal from their authoritarian government, because basically China produces and produces and produces, but the Chinese middle class, they haven't been given the opportunity to really consume. Whereas, we're expected to absorb all of the world's manufactured goods, yet, you don't have enough productivity and you don't have enough savings in the United States, arguably. So I think that you could imagine a new deal for the global middle class that would see to it that, the Chinese are consuming more, they become more affluent, and thus can consume more American manufactured goods, and vice versa.
What do you say directly to a guy like Scott who just called in? What do you say to all those people, and there are literally tens of millions of them, who say, I'm worried that they're going to ship my job overseas?
I think that, they are right to be concerned because the number of jobs that are going to be eligible for foreign competition is only increasing rather than decreasing. But I think that, the reality is that it is a lot of other countries that are unbalanced. Their economies are unbalanced in such a way that's created these problems. And that's also creating all kinds of other political problems as well. The problems that you're seeing in Iran this week are going to be recreated in China and India and elsewhere unless those countries are capable of actually creating a robust, flourishing middle class. So what I'm trying to tell Scott and the millions of other folks who are in the same boat is that actually the middle class in these other countries, they're not your enemy. They're actually your friend. And the bad guys are these elites in those countries that are actually preventing their populations from becoming as prosperous as they can be.
1-800-955-1776 is our phone number. Speaking with Reihan Salam. He is the co-author of the book just out in paperback, A Grand New Party, How Republicans Can Win the Working Class and Save the American Dream. When we come back, I want to focus for just a few moments on what you consider to be the most important change that needs to be made in Republican presentation to the working class of the United States. We'll be right back with Reihan Salam and your calls.
The Michael Medved studio lines are sponsored by GoToMyPC.com. Access your office PC from anywhere with GoToMyPC.com. Michael Medved Show. 1-800-955-1776. 1-800-955-1776. This is the Michael Medved Show.